Yes, thank you for having me here this morning. We welcome the move to extend the SRD, but of course, as we've argued in the past, one, an extension of 3 months is not adequate, but two, our call still stands that this amount needs to be increased to at least the food poverty line of 585 Rand a month. And also, importantly, our other call still stands to say that it should include caregivers who are primarily women are excluded because they're beneficiaries, or rather they are the recipients of child grants, and therefore they are unable to receive this grant. But lastly, I think critically, we have called for a universal basic income grant, and an extension of 3 months does not indicate necessarily that this will develop into that. So again, we are calling for this grant to be a basis in which we develop a universal basic income grant for the long run. And we, of course, welcome the extension. Obviously, we would have preferred, and we still call for these additions and extensions of the grants to take place as well.
In your call for a universal basic income grant, how do you then believe that commitment will assist in, this new economy that the president has been speaking about when he says that the pandemic has produced and allowed the opportunity to rethink the economy of the country?
Absolutely. A universal basic income grant is good for many reasons. In fact, this is a long ongoing conversation in South Africa. Even in 2003, the Taylor report, there was a call for a universal basic income grant. And effectively in that report, they argued that if every South African got 100 Rand, that poverty would have declined significantly by over 70%. And so when we think about this current context where there's high unemployment, and employment is not something we're going to resolve overnight. So it is critical that we ensure that households have incomes. South Africa has got a demand problem as well. So by giving households income, in fact, what you do is also help the demand. People talk a lot about grants as sort of a cost, but people don't really talk about the economic benefits of an income grant, right? The benefits of people having incomes. Of course, we can make the arguments for human rights, which is very critical. And that is basically the baseline for why we should have a universal basic income grant, is that we need to protect people's livelihoods. And the president has mentioned this in the past, that we need to protect people's lives and livelihoods. So it's very important that we think in our new economy, what is just? And what is just is that people have incomes. What is just is that in the context of high inequality, income and wealth inequality, that people have access to their basic needs. And those require incomes to be able to access. And so we also need to think about the context of basic services, the provisioning of basic services. In the absence of an adequate provisioning of basic services, and basic income grant is very critical to our current context. And of course, we're not going to solve poverty again is another issue that will not be resolved overnight, which is why we say that 350 Rand is not enough. It falls below the food poverty line. So it's certainly not enough to deal with what we need right now.
With the president committing and dedicating a large part of his speech last night on government's economic recovery plan, he really mentioned some shocking, perhaps, realities that we are becoming accustomed to, saying that 1.7 people were jobless in the third quarter of 2020 and the unemployment rate sat at around 30.8%. With all of those figures standing out very strongly, and some of the intervention plans that he announced, what did you make of the effectiveness of these plans when it comes to the real faces on the ground and the people who are really bearing the brunt?
Yeah. I think those statistics are critical. In fact, those were some of the things I highlighted first when I read this speech. I think it is important to acknowledge that there will be no recovery without rescue. The Institute for Economic Justice recently did a scorecard where we basically assessed how the 500 billion has been utilized, and we estimate that only about a third of it has been utilized in our economy. So that tells you something about the fact that we haven't sufficiently stabilized the economy. There cannot be a recovery without stabilization. There's a reason people on the ground are not feeling the impact of the recovery of the rescue package itself. And that's because partly it hasn't been utilized in the way that it was supposed to be. And so when I think about this speech, there's an inclination towards we need to move to recovery, but we have to acknowledge that we are still in emergency. And that requires emergency rescue measures. It requires that the 500 billion as planned is implemented and utilized in the way that was intended. We can't move to the next phase without the foundation that needs to be set. And in fact, the rescue measures are the foundation in which our economy should be built. We cannot build an economy when our foundation is not sufficient, it's not steady. And so that's really my reaction in terms of the speech. It's, it talks about the economic recovery plan, which we know about and so forth. But again, we cannot move to recovery phase without acknowledging that the lockdowns haven't even ended. The crisis hasn't even ended. And in fact, last year's announcements of the measures themselves did not take into account the forever changing lockdowns that we're actually still going to experience. And so we need to go back and think about what are the emergency measures that need to take place continuously. It's not a once-off event. Emergency rescue measures are not a once-off event, and then we just come on and we recover. So I think, again, it's this issue of we're putting there's, what do they say, the cart before the horse. And it is important that we really focus on those rescue measures right now, with households being central to that.
Thank you so much. Let's leave it there for now. That analysis coming from Busi Sibeko from the Institute for Economic Justice.